The thermometer outside Mike Anderson's cabin window read 40 degrees below zero, and the numbers were still dropping. In the 5 years he had lived in this remote corner of Alaska, he had never seen temperatures fall so low. The storm approaching was not just another winter challenge. It was the kind that made even the most seasoned wilderness dwellers question their choices. Mike's cabin stood alone, deep in the heart of Alaska's unforgiving wilderness, where the nearest town was a grueling 4-hour drive away. A solitary outpost against the relentless cold, the wooden structure had endured countless storms, weathered by time and the harsh elements. It had been his home ever since he chose to abandon his bustling life as a wildlife photographer in Seattle. But tonight, as the wind howled through the towering pines, he knew this decision would be tested like never before. The February morning had begun like any other. Mike woke to the familiar crackling of the fireplace, the last remnants of glowing embers barely reaching the corners of his modest living room. A glance through the frost-covered window revealed fresh snow, another thick layer added to the deep drifts outside. At 45 years old, survival in this remote wilderness had become second nature to him. His mornings were a carefully rehearsed routine, checking the weather radio, assessing his supplies, ensuring his equipment was in working order. His cabin, though simple, was well-stocked, preserved food, medical supplies, emergency gear. The walls were lined with photographs he had taken over the years, images of wolves, moose, and bears frozen in time, silent companions in his solitude. That morning, the weather report was troubling. A massive storm system was moving in from the north, bringing record-low temperatures and winds strong enough to snap trees like twigs. Mike knew all too well what that meant, days, possibly weeks, of being trapped indoors. He spent the morning securing his generator, checking his backup heating system, and reinforcing every measure he had put in place to survive the brutal winter. By afternoon, the first wave of the storm hit. Snow fell in thick, blinding curtains, reducing visibility to mere feet beyond his porch. He threw more logs into the fireplace, the flames crackling with renewed life, and began his usual storm preparations. He filled several large containers with water, knowing full well his pipes might freeze despite the heat tape wrapped around them. Extra firewood was stacked inside, emergency lanterns double-checked. Living alone in these extreme conditions had changed him, made him more patient, more observant. He had learned to read nature's subtle warnings, the eerie silence before a storm, the shift in air pressure, the particular kind of stillness that always preceded something dangerous. His satellite phone, his only reliable link to the outside world, sat fully charged on his desk beside his emergency radio. The nearest ranger station was 50 miles away. If anything went wrong, help would not be coming, not in time. Yet Mike had long since learned to embrace the isolation, finding solace in the quiet moments, strength in his self-reliance. As night fell, the storm intensified. The wind clawed at his cabin, finding every tiny gap in the wooden walls, turning them into eerie whistles that sent shivers down his spine. He prepared a simple meal, canned soup and bread, conserving his fresh supplies for what might be a long stretch indoors. But what happened next would shake him to his core, challenging not just his survival skills, but his very humanity. Just after midnight, a sound cut through the howling wind. At first, he thought he had imagined it. A deep, guttural noise, barely audible, but unmistakable to someone who had spent years photographing wildlife. A bear, and it was close. His blood ran cold. In February, bears should be deep in hibernation. If one was active now, in these conditions, something was terribly wrong. Grabbing his flashlight, he approached the window cautiously, the beams slicing through the swirling snow. The thermometer now read 45 below zero, the wind chill making it feel even colder. Then, through the blizzard, he saw them, 3 dark shapes moving sluggishly through the whiteout. A mother bear and her 2 cubs. Mike's breath caught in his throat. Even from this distance, he could see they were struggling. The mother's powerful stride was reduced to a weary shuffle, her movements slow and labored. The cubs huddled against her, fighting against the merciless wind. He had spent years observing wildlife, studying their behavior, learning their patterns. and what he saw now sent a deep unease through him. The mother bear was desperate. No animal would willingly expose their cubs to such lethal conditions unless they had no choice. Something must have disturbed their den, forcing them out into the killing cold. They were moving toward his cabin, seeking shelter from the storm. In the beam of his flashlight, he saw the ice forming on their fur, the violent shivering of the cubs, their tiny bodies unprepared for this level of cold. The mother's steps grew more unsteady, her massive frame swaying as exhaustion set in. Mike knew the rules. A bear near a human shelter was dangerous under any circumstance. But these were not normal circumstances. The mother bear reached his porch and began pawing weakly at the snow, trying in vain to create some form of shelter. But the wind howled mercilessly, tearing away any progress she made. The cubs, too small and frail for this brutality, were barely able to keep their feet beneath them. Then, before Mike's eyes, one of them collapsed into the snow. The mother nudged it desperately, urging it back up, but Mike could see the sluggishness in its movements. The signs of hypothermia were setting in. The second cub fell moments later, its tiny body trembling, then slowing. The mother let out a low, mournful sound, something between a growl and a whimper, raw desperation carried away by the wind. Mike pressed a hand against the frosted window, his breath fogging the glass. He had photographed hundreds of bears in his career, documented their hardships, their triumphs. But this was different. This was death, creeping ever closer, inevitable if nothing was done. The bears were now huddled directly against his porch, their last, desperate attempt at survival. The cubs had stopped shivering. Mike knew what that meant. Their bodies were shutting down. His hand hovered over the cabin door handle. Every instinct, every rule drilled into him over years of surviving in the wilderness, screamed at him to stay inside. But another voice, a quieter, yet undeniable force, whispered that sometimes rules had to be broken. Outside, the mother bear's glazed eyes locked onto his through the window. There was no wild fury in them, no aggression. Only exhaustion, desperation, resignation. Mike's heart pounded. His father's words echoed in his mind. Nature doesn't forgive carelessness, son. But was it carelessness to try to save them? The storm raged on, snow piling higher against the cabin walls, the wind screaming through the trees. The radio crackled with an update. The blizzard would last another 12 hours. The bears would not survive the night. Mike made his decision. He turned, grabbed the thickest blankets from his emergency supplies, and took a deep breath. Then, with one final glance through the frosted glass, he did the one thing he had been taught never to do. He opened the door. On the morning of the third day, the storm finally relented. The once unforgiving landscape of snow and ice softened under the warming touch of the sun, breaking through the clouds for the first time in days. With its golden light came a renewed sense of hope, a silent promise of survival. Mike knew the time had come. The bears had to return to the wild before they grew too accustomed to human presence. As if she could sense it, the mother bear had grown restless, her instincts pulling her back to the vast, untamed forest. Her cubs, now fully recovered, moved with newfound energy, their tiny bodies brimming with life. With the same care he had shown that desperate night, Mike unlatched the storage room's outer door. The crisp morning air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and melting snow. Sunlight poured into the space, illuminating the bears in its golden embrace. The mother bear lifted her head, nostrils flaring as she took in the fresh, open world beyond the shelter. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she rose to her full height, no longer the exhausted, starving creature she had been 3 nights ago, but a magnificent force of nature once more. The cubs followed their mother's lead, their small bodies moving with renewed strength. At the threshold, the mother bear paused. She turned her massive head toward Mike, their eyes meeting in a silent exchange that transcended language. In that fleeting moment, Mike felt something deep and profound, an unspoken understanding of the bond shared by all living things. Then, with a grace unexpected for her size, the bear stepped forward, leading her cubs back into the snow-covered wilderness. Mike watched as their dark figures grew smaller against the endless white, the cubs playfully bounding through the snow, their near-death experience already forgotten in the way of the young. Their mother, ever watchful, moved more slowly, her powerful form silhouetted against the rising sun. Just before vanishing into the tree line, she stopped. Turning back one final time, she held his gaze from a distance, her presence commanding even in the vast, empty silence. Then, without hesitation, she disappeared into the shadows of the forest, leaving nothing behind but tracks in the snow, a fleeting imprint of an extraordinary encounter. Mike remained by the window long after they had gone, lost in reflection. He had broken every rule of wilderness safety, risked his life on an instinct he couldn't fully explain. Yet, as he watched the sun rise over the transformed landscape, he knew he wouldn't change a thing. In the years that followed, he would sometimes catch glimpses of bears in the distance, wondering if they were the same family he had once sheltered. But he never approached, never reached for his camera. Some moments, he had learned, were meant to be preserved in the heart rather than on a lens. Because survival wasn't just about staying alive. Sometimes it was about remembering the fragile yet powerful connection we share with the wild, even in the harshest of circumstances. Years passed, and Mike's life returned to a rhythm, a quiet harmony in the days that followed that transformative encounter. Yet, the memory of the bears lingered in his heart, a constant reminder of that extraordinary night and the lessons it had taught him. The landscape around his cabin had shifted, the seasons came and went, but the lesson of the wild remained ever present. Though he never saw the mother bear or her cubs again, he often found himself looking out into the forest, wondering if they had truly returned to their domain or if, perhaps, they still remembered him, the strange human who had offered shelter when the world outside was unforgiving. Every so often, he would hear the distant call of a bear in the wilderness, a sound that echoed with both beauty and sorrow, and Mike would pause, a sense of recognition stirring deep within him. He came to understand that the wilderness was not just a place for survival, but a space where connections were forged in the most unexpected of ways. In the silence of the snow-covered forest, the natural world had taught him something far more profound than mere survival instincts. It had taught him humility, respect, and the deep, inexplicable bond that humans share with the creatures of the earth. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Mike was taking a walk through the woods near his cabin, he came across a familiar sight: fresh bear tracks in the dirt. They were unmistakable. His heart raced as he followed the tracks, the memories flooding back. They led him to the edge of the forest, where the trees gave way to a wide clearing. There, in the distance, Mike saw a mother bear and two cubs, now much larger and more powerful, moving through the underbrush. His breath caught in his throat as they appeared, silhouettes against the waning light of the day. The mother bear paused, as if sensing his presence, and for a long moment, their eyes met once again. This time, there was no fear, no need to escape. There was only the silent recognition of something far deeper. Without a sound, the family of bears continued on their way, disappearing into the embrace of the forest. Mike stood there for a long time, watching them go, a sense of peace settling over him. It was as if, in that brief exchange, the circle had closed. The bears were where they belonged, and Mike had become part of something larger than himself, a living testament to the wild's ability to heal, to survive, and to thrive in the face of adversity. As the days went on, Mike found himself spending more time outdoors, feeling a stronger connection to the forest and the creatures that called it home. He had come to realize that the wild had its own rhythm, its own laws, and that it would always be a part of him. But it wasn't just about the animals or the wilderness. It was about the shared understanding between all living things, a reminder that humanity is not separate from nature, but a vital thread in the intricate web of life. Then, one cold winter evening, as Mike sat by his cabin's fire, he heard a soft rustle at the door. He rose slowly, a cautious curiosity pulling him toward the sound. When he opened the door, he was greeted by the sight of something unexpected: a lone cub, smaller than he remembered, standing at the edge of the snow. Its fur was matted, its eyes wary, but there was no fear in its gaze, only a sense of longing. The cub stepped forward hesitantly, its body trembling slightly as it looked up at Mike, as though recognizing him. And in that moment, Mike understood the bond he had shared with the bears was not fleeting. It was not just a story of one night in a storm, but a living connection that had endured through the seasons. With a deep breath, Mike stepped outside, kneeling down to offer his presence, silent and respectful. The cub took one tentative step closer, and then another, until it was standing just within reach. The moment stretched into eternity. Without a word, Mike extended his hand, not to touch, but to offer a gesture of trust, a silent understanding that spoke of survival, compassion, and the unbreakable ties between all living beings. The cub sniffed his hand gently, and for a moment, Mike thought he saw something in its eyes, a flicker of recognition, a flash of something deep and ancient. With a soft growl, the cub backed away, turning back to the wilderness. As it disappeared into the shadows of the night, Mike knew the cycle had come full circle. He was not just a visitor in the wild, he was a part of it. And the wilderness, in its infinite wisdom, had embraced him as one of its own. The world outside would continue to change, seasons would come and go, but the connection between Mike and the wild, between all of us and the creatures that share this planet, would remain enduring and timeless.